Hello everyone. Today, I'm going to tell you a story that took place in New Territories, one of the 3 major regions of Hong Kong. It may sound ordinary at first, but trust me, this story will definitely send chills down your spine. New Territories make up about 86% of Hong Kong's total area, including both the mainland and more than 200 islands of various sizes. Among them is a district called Kwai Tsing, and within Kwai Tsing lies a new town named Kwai Jung, a place well known for being home to one of the largest container ports in the world. Right in the middle of that urban area stands a residential building called Lei King. This 25-story tower was built in 1975, so it's been around for quite a while. In fact, it's considered one of the very first buildings constructed in the area. Everything started on the 3rd floor of this building. There's a room there. A secret one. I say secret because no one dares to stay in it for long. Rumor has it, the place is haunted. People say an old lady once moved in. Even though she had heard all the spooky gossip, she thought to herself, I live a good life. I haven't done anything wrong. What ghost would bother me? But just a few nights after moving in, she started hearing strange moaning sounds, sometimes even crying coming from the hallway. Things in her apartment would randomly shift around for no reason. She couldn't take it anymore and moved out in less than a month. Next came 3 men strong. Tough guys who weren't afraid of anything, who moved into that same unit. At first, they just laughed it off, thinking all the ghost stories were nonsense. But then, one by one, each of them started experiencing strange and unexplainable things. Until eventually, they too had to pack up and leave just a few weeks later. Then more people moved in, one after another, but no one ever stayed long. Eventually, the place was completely abandoned. No one dared to live there anymore. The thick iron door was locked tight, cold and unwelcoming. Even people just walking past, it said they felt a chill run down their spine. The neighbors living on the same floor often heard the sound of high heels clicking in the hallway late at night. Sometimes the door to that unit would suddenly swing open, and they'd hear the voices of 2 girls, sometimes arguing, sometimes crying. Some even claimed to see a dark shadow lurking around the apartment, only to vanish into thin air. The situation dragged on, and eventually, every single resident on the 3rd floor moved out. In Hong Kong, where space is limited and finding a decent apartment is no easy task, having an entire floor left empty speaks volumes about how serious the issue was. That unit later became known as Hong Kong's most haunted apartment, so infamous that it even shook up the local real estate market. The authorities later decided to seal off the apartment with bricks and cement, officially saying it was to create ventilation for the floor below. But everyone living there knew the truth. A tragedy had once taken place in that room, and no one really believed the official explanation. Everything happened on May 8, 1984. It was a Tuesday, and the weather had started to heat up. The air was thick and heavy, as if warning that something terrible was about to unfold. Around 8 p.m., a man suddenly burst into apartment number 16, located on the 3rd floor of the Lei King housing complex. Inside the apartment were 3 members of the Leung family. The mother, Mrs. Yung Wai Kwan, 53 years old, who worked as a school janitor. The eldest daughter, Leung Suet Yi, 22 years old, a recent graduate from an English college in Sim Sha Sui and currently working as a government secretary. And the youngest daughter, Leung Suet Yin, just 18 years old and still in high school. This family used to have 4 members, but the father had passed away a year earlier due to a serious illness. Since his death, the mother and her 2 daughters had been relying on each other to get by. The eldest daughter, Suet Yi, worked while also helping her mother take care of her younger sister. Everything happened so fast. Mr. Chu, a neighbor living in Unit 30 on the same floor, was the one who witnessed the whole thing. He recounted that on that day, a strange man suddenly rushed in, grabbed the mother right in the hallway, and forced the 2 daughters to open the door. Suet Yi, out of deep concern for her mother, immediately opened it. As soon as he got inside, the man pulled out a knife and launched a frenzied attack, first targeting Suet Gan, the younger sister, then the mother, and finally Suet Yi. All three were stabbed multiple times and collapsed on the spot. The attacker quickly fled the scene, leaving behind a horrifying scene of blood and chaos. Mr. Chu was in shock, but he still managed to call the police in time. Authorities and an ambulance arrived shortly after. All three victims were rushed to Princess Margaret Hospital, which was only about 1 kilometer away from the scene. Upon arrival, doctors confirmed that all three had suffered multiple deep stab wounds, especially to major arteries, putting their lives in critical danger. The two daughters, Tuet Nan and Tuet Thi, sadly didn't survive. Their mother, Mrs. Hu Quan, though seriously injured, was fortunately saved in time. News of the incident spread rapidly, first throughout the apartment complex, then across the entire area. Not only Amar Chu, but many other residents had either witnessed or heard parts of what happened. Based on eyewitness accounts, the police identified the suspect as a slightly overweight man who seemed to be familiar with the family, possibly even Tuet Thi's boyfriend. The reason why: just 4 days before the incident, Tuet Thi had gone to the police station to report that she was assaulted by a man. However, her mother later persuaded her not to pursue the case, fearing that making a big deal out of it might ruin her daughter's reputation and future. The man she accused was actually someone Tuet Thi used to know. Asterisk, to understand their relationship better, we have to go back in time to the years when Tuet Thi was still studying at the English college in Tsingsha Sui. Back then, she met a male classmate named Deep Thu Van. He was the second son in his family and lived in the Watai estate, Sha Tin, about 11 kilometers from Tuet Thi's home. On weekends, Thu Van would often ask Tuet Thi out, and over time, the two began dating. After graduating, Tuet Thi started working. She became a secretary at a government office. As for Deep Thu Van, at that time, he had already joined the Hong Kong police force and became a member of the mobile unit. Their busy schedules meant they didn't get to see each other as often as before, but they still kept in touch daily over the phone, and their relationship remained strong. Thu Van was the kind of boyfriend people would describe as very obedient. If his girlfriend didn't like smoking, he quit smoking. If she didn't like drinking, he quit drinking. If she didn't like gambling, he gave that up too. However, there was one issue. Their relationship had not yet been fully accepted by either of their families. Thu Van's parents were very fond of Tuet Thi. They even hoped the two would get married soon. But on the other hand, Tuet Thi's family didn't like him much. They felt that Thu Van had a hot temper, was quick to anger, and wasn't someone truly trustworthy. In short, they didn't want their daughter to be involved with him. Asterisk, later on, due to some disciplinary issues, Thu Van was dismissed from the police force. He had to take a temporary job at a hotel with more free time on his hands. He began picking Tuet Thi up and dropping her off from work every day, as if to prove he was still a responsible man. But to the Luong family, that didn't help improve their impression of him. On the contrary, once they found out he had been kicked out of the force, their dislike only deepened. Every time Thu Van visited their home, the atmosphere was cold and tense like a tightly wound string. Asterisk. Then something serious happened. Suspecting that Tuet Thi was seeing another man, Thu Van attacked him so violently that the man was seriously injured. At first, Tuet Thi tried to justify it. Maybe he acted out of love. Maybe he was just jealous because he cares too much. But over time, his jealousy turned extreme. He forbade her from talking to or even meeting any other men. Coupled with her mother's strong disapproval, Tuet Thi gradually came to her senses. She started to realize that this man might not be the right person to spend her life with. From then on, she began to distance herself, talking to Thu Van less and less. Asterisk. In October 1983, Tuet Thi's father fell seriously ill and had to be hospitalized. Just 5 days later, he passed away. The loss of the family's pillar was a devastating blow. At that time, Thu Van took the initiative to help organize the funeral and even called on friends to lend a hand. This act of kindness softened Thu Thi's mother's view of him. She began to accept him, thinking that at least he was someone with loyalty and compassion. From then on, the relationship between the two improved. Thu Van continued to take Tuet Thi to and from work like before. Eventually, for the sake of convenience, Tuet Thi's mother agreed to let him move in and live with the family. From that point on, the neighbors began to recognize Thu Van. They found him friendly and talkative. Some even jokingly called him the chubby guy, but no one could have imagined that very decision would be the beginning of a horrifying tragedy. Tuet Thi had a younger sister, Lung Tuet Nan, 4 years her junior, who was still in high school. Ever since Thu Van moved in, the younger sister didn't like him at all. She felt the house had become noisy and chaotic, seriously affecting her studies. By December 1983, just 2 months after Thu Van had moved in, there was a day when only he and Tuet Nan were home. Tuet Nan was studying when she heard Thu Van talking on the phone with his friends in his room. He was laughing and talking loudly. His voice echoed all down the hallway. Unable to take it anymore, Tuet Nan stood up, walked to his door, and said directly, "Please lower your voice, I need to study." But Thu Van's reaction was explosive. Instead of listening, he stormed out of the room and punched her straight in the face. The blow left her bruised and even broke one of her teeth. When the mother and Tuet Thi returned home and saw Tuet Nan's condition, they immediately called the police. After the incident, Thu Van was kicked out of the house on the spot. But what no one could understand was, despite him assaulting her younger sister and being completely cut off by the family, Tuet Thi and Thu Van's relationship still continued. Just a few days after the incident where he assaulted her younger sister, something unexpected happened. Tuet Thi reconciled with Thu Van. Not only that, she even attended the wedding of Thu Van's older sister, along with her mother and Tuet Nan, as if nothing had ever happened. After that event, Thu Van was once again allowed to come and go freely at the Luong family's home, as though everything had blown over. But then, on February 4th, 1984, something happened. Something that finally made the entire Luong family see Thu Van's true colors. That afternoon, Tuet Thi's mother received a phone call from Thu Van. He sounded panicked and told her that Tuet Thi had just been in an accident and was being rushed to the hospital. Terrified, she grabbed her younger daughter, Tuet Nan, and they both raced to the hospital in a panic. But when they arrived and searched every emergency room, they couldn't find anyone named Luong Tuet Thi. Hospital staff confirmed no patient by that name had been admitted that day. The mother and daughter were stunned. That's when they realized they had been deceived. They rushed back home. As they opened the door and stepped inside, the scene before them was beyond belief. Tuet Thi was lying motionless on the sofa, her upper body unclothed, a rag stuffed in her mouth, and her hands tied behind her back, and Thu Van was sitting on top of her. The mother screamed and immediately called the police. In the chaos, she cried, shouted, and drove Thu Van out of the house. At that moment, Thu Van dropped to his knees, begging for forgiveness with a choked voice. He said that the two of them had been arguing, and he just wanted some private time with Tuet Thi to talk things through. But then, he claimed, he lost control, and that's when everything spiraled out of hand. However, what was even more shocking was that when the police arrived, the mother suddenly changed her attitude. She began to worry that if the incident became public, it would damage her daughter's reputation and future. She insisted it was just a misunderstanding and didn't want to escalate the matter. Left with no choice, the police left, and the whole incident was temporarily swept under the rug. But from that day on, the relationship between Thu Van and the Lang family completely fell apart. The mother bluntly said that she would never allow her daughter to see that man again. And this time, Tuet Thi also firmly broke up with him. The only thing was, Thu Van refused to let go. On May 8, 1984, at his home in Wo Tai Estate, Sha Tin, the man suddenly began acting strangely. He quietly went into the kitchen and took out a knife about 20 centimeters long. His parents were alarmed and tried to stop him, but he brushed them aside and walked out. At 5:30 p.m. on the 3rd floor of Lei King Estate, a neighbor unexpectedly saw the man kneeling in front of apartment 16, Tuet Thi's home. He was crying, repeatedly calling out her name. Curious onlookers began to gather, watching as he remained on his knees, begging for forgiveness. At that moment, only Tuet Thi's mother and younger sister were home. They completely ignored him and even shouted through the door, telling him to go away. But when they saw Tuet Thi approaching from a distance, standing at the base of the building, about to come upstairs, they panicked. Her mother and sister yelled out the window, "Don't come up. Go back, he's here." Tuet Thi looked up and saw the worried faces of her family. She immediately realized what was going on. Turning on her heel, she ran to the nearest police station to report the situation. By 6:30 p.m., 2 police officers accompanied Tuet Thi back to the apartment. Thu Van was still kneeling at the door, tears streaming down his face. He pleaded, begged for forgiveness, poured out his misery, hoping to be taken back. But Tuet Thi coldly walked into the apartment. From inside she shouted, "I will never forgive you. If you don't leave right now, I'll tell the police everything about who you really are." Those words echoed down the hallway in front of the police and the watching neighbors. Thu Van was speechless. With nothing left to lose, he froze. The police, thinking it was merely a quarrel between former lovers, advised him to leave. Under pressure, he quietly followed the officers out of the building. Inside the apartment, the mother and her 2 daughters finally let out a sigh of relief, thinking it was all over. But what they didn't know was that the real tragedy was only just beginning. Just half an hour later, the mother opened the door, only to freeze in shock right outside. Was Thu Van still kneeling, as if he had never left? The moment he saw her, he lunged forward, wrapped his arms tightly around her legs, sobbing uncontrollably, begging for forgiveness, pleading for one last chance. Terrified, the mother pulled herself free and slammed the door shut. She immediately called Thu Van's parents, asking them to come take their son home this time. She could feel something was terribly wrong. At 7:40 p.m., Thu Van's parents finally arrived. They found their son still kneeling outside the apartment door, his face streaked with tears and mucus. Completely ignoring all attempts to reason with him, his father, furious, yelled at him to get up and go home. But Thu Van suddenly screamed, "Like a madman, I'll go home fine. But if I do, I'll die right in front of you." From inside the apartment, Tuet Thi responded coldly, "Even if you die, I won't shed a single tear." Hearing those words, Thu Van froze for a few seconds. At first, his face looked confused, blank even. But then, his expression shifted. His eyes darkened, turning sharp and cold, still appearing calm. He turned to his parents and said quietly, "I need to use the bathroom." Then he walked away, heading toward the stairwell inside the apartment. Madame Duong Hu Quan felt the situation had finally begun to calm down a bit. She could see neighbors still gathered outside, and Thu Van's parents hadn't left yet either. Not wanting to escalate things any further, she decided to open the door and gently pulled the 2 elders out into the stairwell for a private conversation. Her heart was heavy with worry. All she really hoped for was that they would take their son to see a psychiatrist, because deep down, she knew if this went on any longer, it could become truly dangerous, but she had no idea. Every single word she just said, Thu Van heard it all. At that moment, he had just returned from going to the restroom. He stood there, expressionless, his face cold as ice. Then, without warning, he pulled out a knife nearly 20 centimeters. Long, in a flash, he lunged forward and grabbed Madame Duong, holding her hostage. He dragged her backwards, step by step, forcing her toward the door of apartment 16 on the 3rd floor. And he shouted, loud enough for the whole building to hear, "Those 2 girls inside don't open the door. I'll kill their mother right here, right now." The neighbors who witnessed the scene were thrown into panic. Some screamed, others ran back into their apartments, too terrified to watch any further. Madame Duong, feeling the knife pressing against her, realized just how unstable he was. She shouted desperately to her daughters inside, "Don't open the door. No matter what, do not open the door." But Tuet Thi, her eldest daughter, was frozen with fear for her mother's life, heart pounding, unable to think clearly. She didn't listen. She opened the door. At that very moment, Thu Van shoved Madame Duong aside and lunged forward, swinging the knife at Tuet Thi, her younger sister, who was standing right next to her, immediately rushed in to stop him. But by then, Thu Van seemed to have turned into a demon, ferocious and completely out of control. He continued his assault without hesitation. Tuet Thi was repeatedly attacked. Madame Duong, terrified to the core, struggled to her feet and ran as fast as she could into the kitchen to hide. Everything unfolded right before Thu Van's parents' eyes. They stood there, frozen in place, witnessing the entire scene without moving a muscle. They didn't call the police. They didn't try to intervene after seeing how horrifying things had become. The 2 of them simply walked away silently and returned to their own home. After committing the crime, Thu Van calmly walked out of the apartment building. He strolled slowly along the street, as if nothing had happened. However, several residents had already called the police. Emergency responders and law enforcement quickly arrived at the scene. At that time, witnesses saw that the 2 Luong sisters had been stabbed multiple times, especially around the neck, which was nearly severed. Madame Duong was also severely injured. On the way to the hospital, both daughters succumbed to their wounds. Madame Duong, though critically injured, miraculously survived after a month in intensive care. Around 2 a.m. the next morning, on May 9, 1984, the police raided Thu Van's home and arrested him on suspicion of murder. Throughout the arrest, he offered no resistance, remaining completely silent. Mr. Trong, a resident of apartment No. 13, directly across from Unit No. 16, was the one who witnessed the entire incident and was also the first to call the police. In his statement, he clearly testified that the killer's parents did absolutely nothing to intervene or stop the crime. They simply stood there and watched. Even when they borrowed Mr. Trong's phone, they didn't call the police. They just dialed 3 numbers, said into the phone, "2 people are dead," and then left the scene immediately. 5 months later, on October 20th, 1984, the case was officially brought to trial at the Hong Kong High Court. Thu Van was charged with 2 counts, murder and serious assault. During the trial, he pleaded not guilty to the murder charges, only admitting to the assault. He claimed that Tuet Thi had provoked him, causing him to lose control of his emotions and commit the act. He insisted it was a spontaneous outburst, not a premeditated intention to kill. After 6 days of trial, on October 26th, the entire jury reached a unanimous verdict. Thu Van was guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to death. Upon hearing the verdict, he refused to accept it and filed an appeal. Half a year later, in 1985, the High Court agreed to open a second trial. This time, 5 judges were present. The defense attorney maintained the argument that Tuet Thi provoked the defendant, citing her harsh words, "Even if you die, I won't shed a single tear." The defense claimed that it was precisely this statement that drove Thu Van into a state of emotional frenzy, leading to the crime. They also argued that during the first trial, the presiding judge failed to properly instruct the jury on the significance of this provocation, which they considered a serious oversight. However, Chief Judge of the second trial firmly rejected that argument. He clarified that, to consider a crime as an impulsive act, The defendant's reaction must occur immediately after the provocation. In this case, Thu Van did not lose control right away. Instead, after hearing the remark, he pretended to go to the bathroom, then returned with a knife in hand. What's more, he went as far as to take Mrs. Duong hostage to threaten the others, a clear indication that his actions were deliberate and premeditated. Therefore, on March 12, 1985, following the retrial, the appeal was officially rejected. The death sentence remained unchanged. Later on, Mrs. Duong miraculously survived, but she eventually moved out of apartment 16. Not long after, eerie rumors began to circulate around the unit. Some claimed that late at night, they could hear the sound of a TV playing inside the apartment, even though no one lived there. Others spoke of the sound of dripping water, or even voices of two girls conversing softly behind the walls. To ease public anxiety, the housing authorities eventually renovated apartment 16 along with the neighboring unit, converting them into a technical room for electrical monitoring. The front door was sealed off entirely. However, the ghost stories surrounding the apartment persisted for many years. Some residents even believed that the spirits of the two Leung sisters were still lingering, unable to find peace, and that they would not rest until the killer left this world for good. Until early 2012. A resident living in the Lei King building shared a chilling experience. That day, as he was walking past the third floor, he suddenly saw a dark shadow glide past the nearby utility room. Startled, he quickly turned back and looked carefully inside, but there was no one there. The room was completely empty, and the silence inside was unnervingly eerie. Then in June 2014, another unsettling incident occurred. A young woman, who was pregnant but not yet married, was found sitting silently on the rooftop of the Lei King building, still wearing her hospital gown. Her intention that day was clear. She wanted to end her life. Fortunately, someone noticed her just in time and rushed over to stop her, ultimately saving her life. But the story didn't end there. In August 2018, a man around 55 years old climbed to the rooftop of the Lei King building. This time, no one arrived in time to save him. By the time police and rescue teams showed up, he was already gone. A suicide note was found on his body, where he mentioned his illness and exhaustion from life. However, after the incident, rumors began to spread. Some claimed that he might have been possessed by the spirits of the two Lang sisters, and perhaps that's what drove him to take his own life after a series of heartbreaking incidents at the Lei King estate. Apartment 16, the site of that once horrifying murder, eventually earned a chilling nickname from local residents: the most haunted house in Hong Kong. Strange stories, ghostly whispers, unexplainable sightings to this day. The eerie legends surrounding that apartment still get passed around, like a shadow that refuses to fade. As for Thu Van, the man behind that horrific crime to this day, he has yet to be executed. He remains in prison, serving his sentence, living in silence, with no one truly knowing what's going on inside his mind.